Hello to the esteemed audience of Black and White Cipher. Today we will tell a story with an extremely unexpected ending about Rexy Company. We have very little information about the childhood of Decry, but in 1985, Rexy's family moved to Los Angeles when he was still a child. Rexy's family faced significant financial difficulties, so they didn't have many choices, and Rexy's family had to move to a very dangerous area. The crime rate and violence in this area were constantly increasing, with many gangs operating. Rexy was the youngest in a family with two older brothers and one sister. The two eldest had gone to school far from home, while his older brother, Kenny, was 5 years older than Rexy. Rexy was only 10 years old. Not long after moving, Kenny joined one of the gangs in the area. Over time, he began to encounter major obstacles, and the gang Kenny joined had frequent clashes with another gang. One day, members of the rival gang conducted a sudden attack on Kenny's gang. They got into cars and brought weapons, then quickly attacked Kenny's gang's area. They fired, hitting a group of people standing by the roadside. While Kenny was standing nearby, he was unable to escape the gang's attack. After this incident, Decry felt very desperate, but he tried to focus and study to forget what had happened to his older brother. His family also tried to help Decry overcome this difficult situation. However, the environment around Decry remained very volatile. Because of this, he became very close to his older brother Kenny. He also became acquainted with his brother's friends, all of whom were involved in the criminal underworld. Over time, Decry neglected his studies, dropped out, and followed in the footsteps of his older brother. As things got worse, with his family breaking apart and Decry's parents divorcing, his eldest brother also found a job in another city and left him behind. As for Decry's second older brother, they reconciled and lived together. After Decry's mother left, his father also moved away and lived alone elsewhere. There was no longer a home for Decry to return to, except for his mother's apartment. But his impoverished mother couldn't control Decry's rebellious teenage years. She felt very helpless seeing her son drifting further away. Later, Decry's uncle offered him a job in his company, but Decry refused because he wanted to live in a different world, a world of darkness and rebellion. Decry began his career in the illegal drug trade. But things certainly wouldn't be so easy, so it was no surprise when he was first arrested at the age of just 16. The police saw Decry on the street and attempted to question him, but Decry refused to cooperate and tried to escape. He was soon caught again for resisting arrest. By then, the police had discovered that most of Decry's income came from drug dealing. However, because he was still a minor, Decry was only sent to a juvenile detention center for 6 months. Up to that point, although Decry had immersed himself in the criminal world, he had never participated in any violent crimes. After his first brush with the law, Decry went through a period of relative calm until 1995. When Decry was only 19 years old, he was arrested for impersonating someone near a notorious brothel in the area. Decry was charged and eventually convicted of his crimes. Afterwards, Decry was sentenced to intermediate sanctions and sent to Calipatria State Penitentiary, one of the most infamous and high-security prisons in the United States. The image of Decry wearing an inmate uniform indicated that he was a new inmate. Decry, along with the other inmates, boarded the transport vehicle to the prison. As the transport vehicle continued to travel along the roads, it eventually left the city and entered a road with twists and turns, surrounded by impassable cliffs and rivers. Finally, Decry looked out the window of the transport vehicle and saw a desolate field. Before long, he finally caught sight of the prison. It was a sprawling complex, consisting of several buildings, nestled in a remote location like a fortress, where the U.S. government sent those deemed too dangerous to live among the general population for rehabilitation. Decry remained tense from the moment the transport vehicle started moving until it neared the prison, becoming even more tense. As soon as it passed through the first gate of the prison, Decry smelled the stench of decay permeating the air, emanating from the animal pens of the prison's farm. Decry grimaced and his hands gripped the seat, trying to ignore the foul odor, but it persisted relentlessly. Then, the transport vehicle passed through a row of electrified fences encircling the entire prison compound, which were lethal if touched, instantly killing anyone who came into contact. Of course, all the inmates were aware of this. In addition to the electrified perimeter fence, there was also an inner fence without electricity. But if you breached the inner fence, you would encounter the electrified fence, with no way back, meaning there was no escape route through the fences. The purpose of these fences was to keep the inmates concentrated inside the prison, rather than wandering around the perimeter. The prison guards in this facility were few, compared to the number of inmates, with a ratio of about 1 guard to 50 inmates. It was known that just 3 months before the arrival of this new batch of prisoners, a major riot had occurred here. 5 prisoners in this prison had staged a large-scale uprising against the guards, resulting in 8 guards being injured. They attacked the guards with makeshift weapons inside the prison. However, no guards were killed, but this incident caused a shockwave throughout the California prison system. At this point, Reddy and the new inmates were escorted to the main entrance of the prison, and almost all the inmates of the prison were lined up outside to see the new arrivals, looking at the new inmates as a warning. One of the guards went outside, starting to inspect the new inmates one by one. Then the inmates were taken to the processing room. There they were stripped of all their belongings until they had nothing left. At this point, Reddy and the new inmates were issued prison uniforms and taken to their cells. The cells in this prison were like extremely depressing and monotonous cubicles. They had 4 walls and a concrete floor, with no windows. Even the door was fitted with a small metal plate with a small hole for inspection from the outside. The cell was dimly lit, with a bunk bed and a toilet. Reddy entered the cell and began to explore the place, looking around, until he noticed someone sleeping on the lower bunk. This person was his cellmate. When the other person saw Reddy, he turned his head to look the other way, avoiding direct eye contact with him. Although Reddy had been in the cell with his cellmate for most of the time here, he didn't know his counterpart's personality. Therefore, he didn't want to accidentally provoke his cellmate, who could be a very volatile person. Reddy learned early on that to survive in this place, you had to avoid even talking to other inmates. When Reddy entered the cell, he would often lie on his back and stare at the ceiling. From the first week in prison, Reddy knew that this place was dangerous. And the first lesson Reddy learned was when a group of inmates ganged up on him and his cellmate, Xiaomi, tried to welcome and be friendly with them. But these inmates turned on him, beat him up, and even assaulted Xiaomi, while Reddy pretended to sleep and ignored the incident. In the end, that group of inmates backed off from the way Xiaomi handled the situation, not retaliating, as this scenario played out many times. And whenever these inmates moved into the 2-person cells, they always did the same to his cellmate. From that point on, Reddy realized that he needed to fight to survive in this hellhole. Reddy had seen many inmates with makeshift knives, or using them as everyday items, but in a discreet manner. They crafted these knives and sharpened them with the ability to cause serious, and potentially fatal injuries. So, Reddy also had to fashion a knife for himself. The most reliable material he had was his toothbrush handle. Using a stone, Reddy meticulously sharpened the handle of his toothbrush until it was razor-sharp and ready to be used for defense. In this way, he had his own makeshift knife. Every day, prisoners were allowed outdoor recreation and movement within the prison yard. Reddy observed carefully and realized that most of the inmates here belonged to gangs, and he understood that he would need to join a gang to receive better protection and support. But still lying low, getting new inmates to join a gang immediately was very difficult. They first had to prove themselves. At this point, Reddy began to seek out a gang with people he had worked with before getting arrested. He covertly observed the situation from the sidelines, attracting no attention from anyone. Reddy knew that if he drew attention to himself, it would be like a death sentence for him. Although Reddy was still keeping away from all interactions, one day, while he was walking in the yard, a prisoner suddenly approached Reddy. The gang member came up to him and grabbed Reddy by the collar and led Reddy and the gang to the corner of the prison yard. As he was being dragged to the corner, he felt the eyes of all the inmates on him, and they all knew what was happening. Reddy thought that if he didn't resist at that moment, he would suffer the same fate as his cellmate. And that would happen repeatedly because they would see him as an easy target. So, Reddy quickly pulled out his sharpened toothbrush handle and stabbed the gang leader. This stab wasn't meant to kill him. Because if Reddy killed him, the guards would take strict measures against him. And Reddy could even face the death penalty. Besides, this resistance was a warning and a proof of himself to everyone. Reddy wanted everyone to understand that he was not an easy target. And after that stab, the gang backed off and even the gang leader retreated, to avoid experiencing pain again. After the incident, Reddy began to become famous among the prison inmates. It was not surprising that a gang called 49 welcomed Reddy, inviting him to join them. Finally, he was able to carve out a position for himself in this hostile environment. After joining the gang, Reddy continued to explore. Although there were many gangs in Calapacia prison, all these gangs relied on one person to maintain control of this place. He was the kingpin, the most dangerous and powerful prisoner in this prison. His name was Eddie Clark, and they called him El Diablo, which means the devil, in Spanish. Besides being El Diablo's cell, the prison was not only where he lived but also where he conducted his business. Here, illegal activities such as drug trafficking still took place, and all these illegal activities were under El Diablo's management. He built an empire with his minions, and everyone in the prison feared him and tried to avoid provoking El Diablo. Even the guards acknowledged his influence and power in this place, and they made special arrangements to maintain the peace and allow this arrangement to continue. But it seemed that El Diablo could turn this place into hell on earth at any time. Just one riot or one instance of group violence could turn this place into a hellhole at any moment. But El Diablo ruled the prison completely, and no one dared to confront or resist him. Reddy saw El Diablo as the most comfortable inmate in this prison. No inmate or guard dared to challenge him. El Diablo could stroll around with his gang and shoot hoops. They could sit in the yard and chat leisurely without worrying about anyone interfering. Reddy also knew that he should steer clear of El Diablo in this prison. No one was oblivious to his reign of terror. El Diablo was only 30 years old but had spent 20 years of his life in prison. When El Diablo was just a teenager, he showed how much of a bloodthirsty killer he was. At the age of 13, El Diablo targeted another teenager and beat him to death. As a result, El Diablo was thrown into prison, not the least lenient juvenile facility. By the time El Diablo turned 20, he was released, only to return immediately with a gang. It didn't take long for El Diablo to be rearrested after he broke into the home of a prominent homeowner and murdered her son. Consequently, El Diablo was sentenced to life imprisonment. This meant he would live out his days in prison until he aged out of juvenile sentencing. El Diablo's most precious possession was his sharp mind, extremely cunning, and even maliciously capable of attacking those around him without reason. With El Diablo, no one was safe 100%. In his long years here, what he dedicated most of his time to was both physical training and strengthening his mental fortitude. Thus, Reddy's once frail body had transformed into a robust physique, all within 20 years of incarceration. The reason for all this effort was that he had a grand plan for himself. If El Diablo's reign of terror prolonged, he would become a clear and constant threat, always on the brink of eruption. Even El Diablo's closest associates were wary of him. Just one wrong look from any of them could trigger El Diablo into a frenzy of violence. Although Raxi had successfully avoided El Diablo for 4 years, the recent incident would bring him into direct confrontation with El Diablo. And 10 years ago, 2 inmates were in a different block, and one of them took a stone to stab the other in the back. This person immediately cried out, prompting all the inmates in the block to lie down for inspection. During the thorough search, one of the inmates found a handmade shank that prisoners used to stab each other. Perhaps one of the prisoners threw it there before the inspection so they wouldn't be caught with the weapon. The inmate didn't know that this shank belonged to El Diablo's closest confidant and right-hand man. The inmate handed the shank over and asked the prisoners whose it was. But none of the prisoners said a word, even though many of them knew whose shank it was. Because if they did, it would be a death sentence for them, and everyone knew that El Diablo would do anything to protect his top henchman. At that moment, El Diablo was lying on the ground with the other inmates, making sure they all stayed down, and began scanning the inmates to see who he could pin the blame on. Without a second thought, his eyes fell on Raxi. At that moment, El Diablo stood up, pointed, and shouted that this man was the owner of the shank. In the following seconds, Raxi began to imagine his future and calculate his odds. If they added a weapons possession charge to Raxi's sentence, it wouldn't affect his sentence much because Raxi had been sentenced to life imprisonment, so nothing would change. But what would be affected was the perception of the other inmates towards him. They would see Raxi as a convicted criminal, and someone El Diablo had marked as a regular target for punishment. Rexy knew he had to stand up to the prison's devil, El Diablo. When the guards asked Rexy about the shank, his answer was simple. "It's not mine." It was a straightforward response, but it would change his life forever, as Rexy had now become El Diablo's target. Everyone was taken aback by this answer, including the guards, and they all wondered how this man dared to defy El Diablo. Immediately afterward, the repercussions didn't manifest, but Rexy knew his situation was becoming precarious. In the following weeks, Rexy was on high alert, thinking that El Diablo or one of his henchmen could attack him at any moment. He couldn't sleep soundly even when lying in his bunk, and every time he stepped outside into the prison's yard, he was on edge. He followed El Diablo and his close associates, trying to keep his distance from them in potentially volatile situations and staying closer to the guards. However, 1 month later, in November 2000, one day while Rexy was strolling in the yard, El Diablo approached him. El Diablo even boldly walked straight up to Rexy. Not knowing what to do, Rexy froze, and El Diablo kept advancing until he stood in front of Rexy and grabbed him with his left hand before stabbing him with his right hand. It wasn't a deadly attack, but it was a painful message to his opponent. El Diablo looked Rexy in the eye as if to say that Rexy's days in the prison were numbered. When El Diablo let go of Rexy, he spat at him and walked away. At that moment, the guards who usually kept watch were conveniently absent, and no fellow prisoners intervened. They all acted as if they hadn't seen anything. Even the guards made no move to intervene, they just continued pressing their keys against their posts. After a while, it became clear that the incident had ended, and all the prisoners had to return to their cells. But before leaving, they had to line up, and the guards checked them for weapons or contraband. It was a routine check they always did. After the break, all the prisoners lined up, with Elnia and Lo at the front and Rexy a few prisoners behind. Rexy was still clutching his makeshift weapon and trying to conceal it from the guards. But what Rexy was trying to hide wasn't the most important thing. He had buried the shank he had taken from outside and concealed it carefully so he could use it if needed. A few minutes before leaving the yard, Rexy grabbed the shank and stood in line with a menacing look. This time, Elnia and Lo were conducting the inspection, checking the prisoners from the front before turning to inspect them from behind. As Elnia and Lo turned their backs to check, Rexy looked at the prisoners standing behind and noticed something suspicious in that line. While the guards were still inspecting, Rexy suddenly stepped out of line and quickly lunged towards Elnia and Lo with the shank in hand. Everyone stood in shock, unable to believe what was happening before their eyes. Elnia and Lo opened their eyes in astonishment, then in pain, as Rexy's body, now covered in blood, collapsed. The shank was pulled out from the wound of the fallen man. With both hands, Elnia and Lo tried to stop the bleeding by applying pressure, but it was too late. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. Elnia and Lo sank to the ground, clutching themselves in pain. And before the guards could react or intervene, Rexy lay down on the ground and put his hands on his head, a gesture of surrender, and yelled out, "I know what I've done! I know what I've done!" Rexy tried to reason with the security staff desperately. He wouldn't harm anyone else, and his sole target was Elnia and Lo. Rexy was immediately apprehended by the guards and taken to solitary confinement. The entire prison was on high alert that night, and the deaths of Elnia and Lo could have led to a major riot in the prison. Now all the prisoners were locked in their cells, forbidden from leaving for any reason. Rexy, currently facing a potential second-degree murder charge, was in dire straits. It meant that if he were convicted, Rexy would likely face the maximum penalty. Everyone had witnessed what had happened, and he admitted to it, so the only defense for Rexy would be to claim self-defense. But even if he succeeded in convincing his defense that it was an act of self-defense, and even if he managed to avoid a capital sentence, Rexy would still be sentenced to a minimum of 10 years in solitary confinement. He was in such a state of despair that Rexy could see a bleak future ahead of him. Even though they introduced him to a series of lawyers appointed by the state, and there might be some merit in Rexy's case at trial, he didn't think much about it and just went along with it. For he firmly believed that the outcome would remain the same. But the random series of events that he overlooked was that Retuckver plot would do something unexpected. When Retuckver was conducting research on the initial case files, Rexy was already entrenched in his own legal troubles, stemming from the incident in 1991, when he was still a determined young man. The victim in that case was a 29-year-old homeowner named Fan Lip Gonzalez. When the police arrived at the scene of the crime, there was a male and a female officer, and both of them met the homeowner, whose name was John. They arrested him for investigation because his home was illegal. So John became a key witness in the case, and according to John's testimony, he witnessed everything that happened that night from his home's second floor. The victim arrived, parked his car, got out, and knocked on the door. He was expecting to meet someone, but they told him that the person he was looking for wasn't there. So he turned back to his car, and suddenly 3 armed teenagers approached him and demanded money from him, but he didn't understand what they were saying. Surprisingly, these teenagers left him alone, and they ran away through a nearby alley. John testified that he saw one of the teenagers looking around while they were running away. So he assumed that the person had been shot during the incident. The police investigator assigned to the case was a rookie cop, and this was her first criminal case, so she began looking for suspects in the area where the crime occurred. One of the suspects was Rexy. And on that fateful night, barely 19 years old and working with a gang known for drug dealing, Rexy seemed to fit John's description quite well. Based on this, Rexy was interrogated by the authorities, and he was convicted and incarcerated. After being interrogated and reviewing this evidence, the defense team found several points that could overturn the charges against Rexy. However, even the prison management then retracted her testimony and stated that she had told the police what they wanted to hear, backtracking on her statement about allowing him to continue to operate his illegal home in the U.S. But the most crucial piece of evidence in all of this was something that the defense discovered: the scar on Rexy's leg. Initially thought to be a gunshot wound, it was actually a scar from when Rexy was shot in the leg when he was just 3 years old. This meant that 5 years before I confronted Rexy, he had been shot, and it was evident that the police had seen this scar when they arrested him. They knew it was an old scar and that Rexy didn't walk with a limp, but they feared that the auxiliary police wanted to quickly close this case. As we've mentioned, this was the rookie police officer's first case, so perhaps due to her performance, many crucial details were overlooked. So despite Rexy repeatedly pleading his innocence for a long time, he was still convicted. After Rexy was incarcerated, he spent a long time in the prison library, studying legal books about wrongful convictions. Even during his time in prison, Rexy tried to stay away from violence and trouble, but trouble always found him. He was forced into fights and struggled to survive in a harsh environment. To uncover these truths, the series of trials continued to investigate this case for 3 years, during which Rexy suffered. After he had killed LDVLO, the trial reopened once again. Ultimately, the appellate court acquitted Rexy of the first-degree murder charge, reducing it to second-degree murder. And Rexy was sentenced to 10 years in solitary confinement. By the time Rexy had completed 8 years in solitary confinement, and these 8 years were counted towards his sentence. So Rexy only had 2 years left before he was released from prison. After Rexy spent the final 2 years in his cell, he was finally released from prison with $5,500 in his pocket. After being released from prison, Rexy engaged in a lengthy legal battle to reclaim his rights, and eventually won $2 million in compensation from the Los Angeles government. Of course, this sum of money couldn't make up for what Rexy had gone through during his time in prison. But at the very least, it would help him live a comfortable life for the rest of his days. He then went on to do charity work in many orphanages, hoping to help these children overcome the trauma of their backgrounds and have a better life. That's the end of this story. If you've stuck with our main character until today, please leave your comments below the video's description. Now, goodbye and see you again. Remember to leave a like, subscribe, and click on the notification bell.